You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Hello? Is that the famous astronomer, Sir Patrick Moore?
It is, very much so.
Any news on the space front?
Quite so. Elon Musk has just designed and developed 5 gigantic, state-of-the-art rocket ships. All members of Parliament, along with the American Senate, have first-class tickets aboard them, you see. They're told they're going to the moon.
Told? Where exactly are they going, Sir Patrick?
The new anomaly discovered recently astronomically. A huge black hole.
Welcome to Twin Souls. Twin Souls is brought to you in association with the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Your hosts, Philip and Ronald Kinsella.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's guest is Craig Bryant, author of The Black Monster of Accrington and also The Shadow Man of Accrington. And we're very pleased to say also that Craig has his own podcast, the Paranormal Pendle podcast. Welcome to the show, Craig.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, lovely. Now, my first question, mine and Philip's, we're curious about this. What initially got you involved with the supernatural? Can you tell us about that, Craig?
Yeah, well, it goes back rather a number of years. I am galloping towards the grand old age of 60. I actually just had a birthday recently, which means that I am now closer to 60 than I am to 50. Yeah. However, my interest in the paranormal goes all the way back to when I was quite a small boy. My maternal grandfather was a really good storyteller, but he was also, I think, very interested in the paranormal and very interested in local legends and folklore, of which there is a lot in the area where I live. I live in Lancashire, which is in the northwest of England. I was brought up in the town of Accrington, which was or is a former cotton mill town. So there were very close-knit communities. Yes. And we're going back to the 1970s here, really, the sort of early 1970s. I was probably only about 7, 8, 9 years of age. And in fact, very topical, a lot of how it all started actually was during the power strikes of the 1970s. So people who are not from the UK and remember the 1970s, we had a period where electricity was rationed, yes, and we used to spend many an evening sat around candles, no TV, no radio, nothing like that. And I used to spend an awful lot of time at my grandparents during this sort of period, and It was a 2 up, 2 down terraced house in effect, sort of a cotton mill house, really, typical sort of cotton mill workers' house. And yeah, in the back room there was a range, a very old-fashioned cast iron range. And so during these periods where we had no electricity, I used to sit in front of the range with my granddad, surrounded by candles, obviously very, very atmospheric, quite impressionable, obviously, at that age. I'd say I was probably about 6, 7, 8 years of age, something like that. And my granddad used to tell me stories, and he started off telling me about local legends, about stories such as the Pendle Witches, stories centred very much on the Leeds-Liverpool Canal as well, strangely enough, which was the canal used to go through the town where he lived. It was a town adjacent to Accrington, and that's obviously why the cotton mills grew up in that area, because of the transport on the canals. Yes. And as I got a little bit older, he then started telling me ghost stories. Some of them were no doubt made up. but some of them, there was definite shreds of truth in there. So he used to tell me about the White Lady of Salmesbury Hall, the Screaming Skulls of Turton Tower, which were all local landmarks in and around Lancashire. And so really from a very early age, I became very interested. As I got older, I actively bought books to read on the subject, and I was quite lucky that there was a number of local authors. Kathleen Eyre was one of them. She wrote a book about Lancashire ghosts, and it was only a very thin book, but there was quite a number of really interesting stories in there.
Yes,
very factual stories, mainly around the subjects of boggarts, which are sort of like it's a sort of northern term for a mischievous spirit or poltergeist, really. So there were quite a number of stories in the book about well-known boggart cases, and also haunted houses, haunted stately homes. Some of the large, landowning families in the area obviously had, big stately homes, most of which now are run by either private trusts or by the National Trust.
yes.
But they all have ghosts attached to them. So these books I read right into my teens. Really got really interested in the local folklore and just the history of the area that I lived in and the history of the northwest of England. And then it sort of tailed off really as I got into my teens and into my late teens and into my early 20s. I was obviously less interested. There were other things that I became more interested in. And then I had an experience in my late teens, early 20s, which stayed with me really for right until the present day. And it's one of the stories that I document in the first book that I wrote, The Shadow Man of Accrington. It's the titular story, which I can go into, that experience, obviously.
Yes. I must say, I've never actually myself personally. This is Ronnie. I've never seen a ghost myself. I've never seen anything paranormal in that respect. I have seen the UFOs and I've seen what they deem as the aliens or whatever they are. But never this. And this fascinates me, and I'm very open to it because, like your grandfather, our grandfather was the same. Where although he was open-minded to it, he warned us against tampering with things such as poltergeist. So it's
and also Craig, this is Philip. I have seen a dead departed friend who crossed over and also been in the presence of a poltergeist before, if that's the right word to use. But one of the things I found very interesting about your book was the fact that you've also documented UFOs and animal mutilations and also the strange lights, which is very interesting because I think to some degree there is kind of like a connection on a kind of like level to connect the dots. What do you think about that, Craig?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at one time I think you had definite camps of the investigators, and I think this is probably pre-internet days where you have people who were very much into the paranormal and ghosts, and that's all that they were involved in. And you had people who were very much involved in UFOs and alien abductions and that sort of thing, and they were very much involved in those types of cases. I think with the advent of the internet, with the fact that we now have obviously quite a large community, I think the core of the community is very sensible. I think people such as ourselves, we're very pragmatic about these types of phenomena. I think when you get to the periphery of the community, you can start to get people who are a little bit more, let's say, use these types of experiences for more nefarious purposes. I mean, we've all written books, but we are not millionaires. We are not, million-selling authors by any stretch of the imagination. And the reason why I wanted to write the books really was to get the stories out there to people, because at the end of the day, there will become a time when I'm not here anymore, and I think that those stories really do need passing down. Now, my son, who's 15, almost 16, although he has a little bit of an interest in the subject, he doesn't really have that sort of same interest that I have now. Maybe as he gets older, maybe when he gets to my ripe old age, in the future, he might feel a little bit different about the subject, and perhaps one day he'll pick up the books and think, actually, my dad wasn't a bad writer. But yeah, I do think there's a crossover. I do think there is definitely a crossover, and I think if you go back through history, if you look at some instances of shall we say UFO activity, which would that we would now class as UFO activity. I think back in the I'll use Pendle Hill as an example. Okay, so
yes.
I live very close to Pendle Hill. People that don't know Pendle Hill, it's synonymous with the Pendle witch trials of 1612.
Oh yes.
Now there's been an awful lot of UFO sightings in the area. Documented, documented going back years and years and years. But if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody in, let's say, the 17th century, who's seeing strange lights in the sky over Pendle Hill, the first thing you're going to think of is that it's actually something paranormal, because you don't have any concept of UFOs or space flight or even manned flight, at that stage in history. So you're automatically going to think that it's the devil, or it's ghosts, or it's witches, or it's that sort of thing. So I think there's a definite correlation between the two. And I sometimes, I do subscribe to the theory that I think some, in inverted commas, paranormal activity can be attributed to maybe beings who are coming through from a different dimension. I think certainly some of the UFO stuff that we see, again, is probably interdimensional.
Yes.
And I think there's a definite. It's like a Venn diagram, and I think that little sliver in the middle, there is a definite crossover between the two. And there's a little bit less sniffiness, I think, from the two different camps now about, oh, it has to be paranormal, it's got to be, or it has to be a UFO and it has to be aliens. I think there's a little bit of a crossover now, and I think we're still exploring that. I think as a community, and the people that I speak to, such as your good selves and other people in the UFO and paranormal community, I think there's a realization now that there is a definite crossover between the two.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. Yes. I mean, you're right, Craig. Forgive me for interfering. That's a very brilliant point you raised, because there are still people who categorize them, that pigeonhole them. Whereas I'm so pleased we are of the same mind as yourself in the respect of actually considering that they might be one of the same thing. Even aliens, they could well have been demonic or entities from interdimensional. So they would be looked upon as ghosts, or, as you stated quite rightly, the UFOs would be mistaken for them. But they might well have been spirits or demonic entities or things like that. We just cannot stay.
Yes, Craig, I've read your books, The Shadow Man of Accrington and The Black Monks of Accrington, and I know, but tell our listeners about your experience, please.
That's The Shadow Man of Accrington, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Before you continue, I love the titles of your books. I don't know why, and this is not derogative. This is a very constructive way. They remind me of Doctor Who. As soon as I saw The Black Monks of Accrington, I saw Doctor Who and The Black Monks of Accrington, Doctor Who and The Shadow Man of Accrington. They've got that beautiful supernatural feel to them. So in the word Accrington, it just attracts me, this name.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating place, actually. As a town, there does seem to be an awful lot of paranormal activity. And I think no matter where you go, really, in the UK, I think we're quite blessed, really, with with areas that seem to be centres of paranormal activity and of course UFO activity and other strange activity as well. But just going back to the experience that I had back in back in the 1980s. Actually, it was the mid 1980s. As I said, I'd probably be about 19, 20 at the time, something like that. And I actually used to work at a club behind the bar in the evenings and at weekends, just for a little bit of spending money whilst I was putting myself through college. And this particular club that I worked at is no longer there now. Actually, it was the old Conservative Club, and I'm not getting into politics or anything like that. I simply worked there because my dad used to go and play snooker there because they had full-size snooker tables. And he managed to wangle getting me a job behind the bar for a bit of extra spending money. So before anybody turns off because they think I'm going down a political route, that's not where we're going. But unfortunately, I mean, it was a beautiful building. It was built in about 1890, very Gothic in style, and it was built on 3 floors with a cellar. Magnificent building, and unfortunately, about 10-12 years ago, it succumbed to arson, and it's actually just an unfortunate pile of rubble really now, and I believe that the local council are looking at building some flats on the site, which will be interesting given the amount of paranormal activity that used to happen there. This particular one, and there was also some poltergeist activity as well, which happened shortly afterwards. But I was actually working behind the bar on the ground floor. And we, it was a midweek, probably Wednesday, Thursday evening, something like that. It's obviously quite a while ago now, so I can't remember the exact day. But it was getting late on in the evening, and it was getting to that time of the evening where we were going to close the bar and close the building up. It was around sort of 10 o'clock-ish, something like that. And the layout was that if I was stood with my back to the bar, to my left there was an opening. It was like a serving hatch, probably about 3-4 feet square, and at waist height, and that led into another room, which was the snooker room. So it had the full size 12-foot by 6-foot snooker tables. There were 3 of them in there. And as I said, there was nobody else in the bar, and in fact I knew there was nobody else in the building apart from the guy who was employed as steward of the club, and he was called a gentleman called Bernard, and I knew that he was upstairs on the 3rd floor, stocking the bar up on the 3rd floor. So anyway, as I was stood, and you got to remember this this is before the advent of mobile phones and the internet and everything else, so it wasn't as if I was stood there looking at my mobile phone or anything. I was literally stood there staring into thin air, and I was just listening to the clock ticking down, thinking, it's not going to be long now. I can close the bar up and I can go home. And then suddenly something caught my eye to my left in the serving hatch, and I was probably about maybe 5 or 6 yards away from. It's quite a long bar. Away from the serving hatch, and I turned to my left to have a look to see what it was, because it looked. When you see something like that move in the corner of your eye, the first thing I thought was actually somebody's coming through the back door. They've come up to the bar and they want to drink. How dare they? I want to lock the bar up. And I looked to my left, and the best way of describing it, now at the time, I couldn't attribute what this thing was. It was only later, and I'll sort of get on to that in a sec. It was a very shadowy, dark figure, very tall, very thin. Very long arms, and it was leaning over. There was no facial features. You couldn't see any clothing or anything like that, but it was leaning towards me through this serving hatch. And the only distinguishing feature that I can remember is that it was wearing a hat, of all things, and it looked like a fedora. Now, it's only later on that I started putting 2 and 2 together, when I started listening to people talking about this shadow man phenomena.
Yes.
And thinking back now to what I saw, I am 99.9% sure, one of these shadow people phenomena.
Yes.
And it was quite strange. I stood there and I watched it for probably about 10-15 seconds, which is a long time when you're looking at something that you don't expect to be there, that you can't explain, that your brain can't process what it is, because it is so alien, if that's the right word.
Yes.
So different to what you expect to see. And it was almost like this figure was sort of leaning through this serving hatch and was looking over into the bar. And then quickly as I'd seen it, it just disappeared. So the first thing I did was grab the internal phone, because again, as I said, there was no mobile phones in those days, and we had an internal phone system up to each of the floors. And as I say, I knew that the steward was upstairs on the 3rd floor, so I grabbed the phone. I was quite shaken up at this point, and I rang the number up to the 3rd floor, And he answered the phone, and I said, I think you need to come down. I've just seen something strange. So he said, okay, give me a sec. So anyway, put the phone down. About 20 seconds later, he came down the stairs through the door. And he looked at me, and he just said, you look like you've seen a ghost. And I said, well, strangely enough, I think I just have. And he said, oh, you've seen him too, have you?
Ah.
So I said, what do you mean? And he said, snooker room, tall, thin, shadowy thing, look like a figure, no features, that he sort of described exactly what I'd seen. And I said, yeah, that's exactly what I saw. I said, I thought I was going mad, and he said, no, I've seen it. He said, quite a few other people who've worked down here in the bar over the years, whilst I've been here, have seen this figure. Several of them have put the coat on and left and refused to come back. Some of the members of the club over the years have said that they've seen a sort of dark, shadowy figure out the corner of their eye in the snooker room. So yeah, it would seem that it wasn't just me. It had been seen by quite a few other people. So that was really quite a defining moment, I think, and that was something that stayed with me for a long time.
Did you feel when you saw it? Were you horrified, or were you surprised, or were you? I know you'll be shocked instantaneously, but did that really unnerve you afterwards? Were you on guard afterwards about this?
Yeah, absolutely. At the time, I don't recall really feeling much other than what the heck is that? Or, words to that effect. Yeah. But I think it was afterwards that when you start thinking about what you've seen and you start trying to rationalize what you've seen.
Yes.
And I couldn't rationalize it other than the fact that I'd seen some sort of paranormal spirit, entity, ghost, and especially after what Bernard had said, because he described it as a ghost in exactly the same way that I initially thought that's what it is when I saw it. So yeah, it sort of changed the way that I viewed things a little bit. But then again, I was sort of very young at the time, and it was only really many years later that I suddenly started putting two and two together with what I'd read about the shadow man phenomena and listened to other people talking about the shadow man phenomena. And it was only really at that point that I started to sort of rationalize, what I'd seen.
Yes, I mean, this is a common denominator with people. A lot of people who've seen strange encounters, especially when they're younger, there's always a period of time where they leave it, and later on, curiosity, as they say, killed the cat. Hopefully, it won't kill them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they want to go back to it. They've been shoved down the rabbit hole, and there's no turning back. Now, the shadow people is very interesting because these have been also reported, you may well know, in the national parks in the US, especially by rangers. Of course, they can't report them at the time of employment, but we find out that when they retire, they certainly come clean about them, and even more dreadful things. We're talking about the dogmen or werewolves, whatever, but certainly the shadow man or the shadow men have been spotted. The ones they saw didn't wear a hat, but they were certainly, as you described, certainly like that. Now, the hat is interesting as well, isn't it? He's wearing a hat. It's very interesting. Did you research into any history of this place, whether anyone had died there, but that it could possibly relate to? I mean, it's a ridiculous question itself because perhaps so many people live there, but was there any trauma in that place? Was there any kind of murders or displacement of things? Or
well, for an awful long time, I couldn't find any explanation for what I'd seen. There hadn't been any houses or dwellings on the site prior to the building being built. It had always been a drinking establishment of some sort. It had always been a private gentleman's club, really, up until the point it became affiliated with that political party. It was built by one of two brothers, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Buller. And he was responsible for the largest cotton mill in Accrington in the late 19th century. Now, as siblings are, and I don't actually have any siblings, so I can't, vouch for this, but he had a brother who was completely and utterly different to him. Now, he was very much, he used to enjoy himself, used to like a drink, hence he built this club. His brother was very religious and teetotal and built a church on the opposite side of the road.
Oh, how ironic.
And they had a bit of a competition to see who could build the highest building. And I believe that the drinking establishment was slightly taller by a couple of inches, but obviously we can't measure it now because it's gone. So there was nothing on the site really before that particular building was built.
Right.
However, interestingly, and this only came to light when I was writing the second book. I actually interviewed a local medium for my podcast. A lady by the name of Diane Pate, and she had done an investigation into a property which is a shop on a road called Warner Street in Accrington. Now, Warner Street actually has been reported on quite a lot in both the local and the national press. Seems to be a little bit of a magnet for these ghost hunting groups that sometimes go in, because there are a number of properties in the area that seem to be, quite heavily associated, shall we say, with paranormal activity.
Yes.
Now, this particular place that she went to investigate, she and her husband encountered a very dark, very malicious, very unpleasant spirit, and it was very physical. It actually pushed her husband down the stairs.
God.
And he came through, she said, calling himself Josiah. Now, I started to do some research into, because she told me off recording the actual address. She didn't want the address to go into the recording.
Right.
But for her own reasons, things had happened afterwards that she found really quite upsetting, but didn't want to tell me whilst I was recording, and I respected her privacy on that. But I started to do some research into the area immediately around where the shop was, and it turns out actually there'd been a murder back in 1896. There was a lady by the name of Sarah Coates who was found murdered, and there was a young lad, I think he was about 12-13 years of age, who was originally thought that he had caused the murder because he found the body. He was covered in blood when they found him, but he was insistent that he'd seen a very tall man wearing a hat and a long coat with a big mustache, with a knife, covered in blood, leaving this particular property as this young lad Christopher Hitchin went in and found the body of Sarah Coates. And he was charged initially with the murder and taken to Lancaster prison and Lancaster Castle courts, which is where they had the assizes back in those days. And during the trial, there was a piece of evidence which was submitted in the form of a letter. Now, this letter was written by an anonymous hand. But what it said was that the day after the murder, or a couple of days after the murder, which was obviously, all out in the local press and everything.
Yeah.
It was actually, the letter was actually written by, as I say, by an anonymous hand, but from somebody who had been in a public house in the town of Bolton. Now, if people don't know where Bolton is, Bolton and Accrington are probably about maybe 20 miles apart, something like that. And Bolton is just on the outskirts of Manchester. If you ask a person from Bolton, they will say they are definitely in Lancashire. They are not in Greater Manchester, but it's just sort of on the border. And this letter had said that this person that wrote this letter had been in a public house, and there had been a gentleman in there who has, as he described, he said he was exceptionally tall, very thin, but he had a very large mustache, and he was wearing a hat. But he was very drunk, and as he got more and more drunk, he actually confessed to the murder of as it turns out, Sarah Coates in Accrington. He said yeah, he actually described it. He said, I murdered a woman in Accrington 2 days ago. And then he left the pub. And the person who wrote this letter said, I didn't see him after that. However, the following morning, there was a body which matched the description of this gentleman found dead on the railway lines in the centre of Bolton, near to Bolton Station. So, as it turns out, the court decided not to take this evidence into account. However, it was documented, which is why we know the contents of the letter. Christopher was found guilty of the murder, but back in the late 19th century, even unfortunately, younger people could be sentenced to death.
Yes,
but that was commuted by the court, and as far as we know, he spent a significant portion of his life in Lancaster Prison. But there are no records as to what happened to him after that. But as I say, Warner Street and Cannon Street, which is where the Accrington Conservative Club was, where I saw this shadow man, are probably less than a quarter of a mile away, and from each other. And there have been sightings in various other places, especially near St James's Church, which is actually sort of the midpoint between Warner Street and Cannon Street. There have been sightings over the years of strange shadows, and people have always said, oh, the whole this area is haunted, and it just has been passed down through folklore really over the years. So it's interesting, this entity, which I believe was the gentleman who murdered Sarah Coates. I believe very strongly that he is this gentleman named Josiah. He's the one that Diane encountered, and I also believe that it's the same entity that I saw all those years ago, because they are just in such a tight area.
Yes,
it's too much of a coincidence that they are two different entities, shall we say? So
yes, it would match up actually, because he's in a pub basically, where he lingered, and it's just very bizarre, isn't it? That's interesting.
I think that perhaps on another level, Craig, that we understand that there is another side. People call it heaven or Nevada, that consciousness returns to, and perhaps that some of these souls don't actually cross over because they seem to be in between two states, and perhaps that this is very interesting as to why the shadow man appears. Now, I also wanted to ask you, because your knowledge and your investigations are so varied. I mean, there's the Ribble Valley as well too, with the startling paranormal UF activity there as well too. So what's happening there as well? What was happening at Ribble Valley?
Well, Pendle Hill is, as I said, it's synonymous with the Pendle witch trials.
That's right.
But over the years, there have been a number of UFO sightings in the area. Pendle Hill is just, it's literally, it's in the Ribble Valley. The Ribble Valley is an area which covers sort of the north part of Lancashire, and it borders on the Forest of Bowland, which is it's designated an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's a huge area, hundreds of square miles of very sparsely populated area, and Pendle Hill does seem to be a sort of magnet for UFO activity. There's been a number of sightings over the years. There are a number of local researchers that I've spoken to who very much sort of specialise in unidentified objects within this area. And the area also stretches up to the Yorkshire town of Skipton, which is just over the Lancashire-Yorkshire border. It's probably about 15 miles away from here. And there's an area called Caton Moor, which again, I spoke to Philip Mantle a while ago. He'd done quite a bit of research into that area up there. He'd been up to visit it because, as you well know, Philip's from just over the border on the other side. He's over in Yorkshire, so it's not. It's not too far away. So he's taken a great interest in Caton Moor and the area up there. Gary Hesseltine as well, who I've tried to speak to over the years, not managed to as yet. Hopefully I will. That was the area that he used to work in when he was, I believe, a police officer. He had many sightings up in that area. But it's also linked really down to Pendle Hill, the area around here. Many sightings. I'll give you an example. Back in 2012, there was the local police telephone lines were absolutely jammed one Saturday evening about 9 o'clock, with people ringing saying there's an extremely large bright light hovering over Pendle Hill. Is it a police helicopter? Is it a UFO? What is it? The police stations in Clitheroe and Burnley and Blackburn, all the sort of main towns around the area, they were all being absolutely bombarded with telephone calls. So it was seen by hundreds of people. And this object hovered above Pendle Hill. Some people say that it was they think it was maybe 200-300 feet above the hill, and it hovered there for several hours into the early morning, not moving at all. And then all of a sudden, in the very early morning, about 3-4 o'clock, the witnesses said it literally just shot up, disappeared, and it went from absolutely not moving for about 4 or 5 hours to suddenly shooting off up into the sky and disappearing at speed. Classic behaviour of UFOs, as far as I'm concerned. And there are reports going back even earlier than that. There are reports going back to the turn of the century. There are even reports going back to sort of like the beginning of the 19th century, the early 1800s, where strange lights have been seen in the sky in the area. And obviously back in those days, they could not be attributed to anything other than what people thought were perhaps paranormal activity or ghosts or that sort of thing. But when you look at the reports, and you look at certainly some of the newspaper reports going back to the turn of the last century, they're quite clearly unidentified objects, as we would now call them. And I've got a bit of a theory as to why you've got certain areas that are that seem to be magnets for this type of phenomena. I think a lot of it's got to do with geology. I think the geology of the area is quite strange. I'm not a geologist. I don't profess to be an expert in that field, but I do know that doing some research into ley lines, for instance, there are a number of ley lines which intersect in the area. There are two main ley lines that intersect on the
Yes.
There's one which runs from the west coast near Blackpool, and it goes all the way over to the northeast coast, actually, strangely enough, near Whitby, which is not too far away from where Paul Sinclair does a lot of his research.
Oh, yes.
And then it's intersected by one which runs north to south from Castlerigg Stone Circle up in the Lake District, and it goes all the way down through to Beachy Head down on the south coast. And these two main ley lines, which no matter who you look at, who are experts in ley lines, these two ley lines always come up. So they are two main ley lines in effect, and they intersect right on Pendle Hill. So that to me, that has got to say something about why this area in particular seems to be so prevalent with things like UFOs and obviously paranormal activity as well. I think there's a lot of energy in the area. There's also a lot of water courses as well. There's a lot of rivers. I think a lot of energy flows through rivers. You tend to find that there are certainly quite a lot of paranormal stories related to water courses or rivers, or occur near rivers or lakes or that sort of thing. And also the coast as well, going up towards Morecambe Bay. That area around there is also an area of many reports of UFO activities over the years.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's think there's a lot of energy involved. I think ley lines have got a lot to do with it. I think the geology of the area has got a lot to do with it. The interaction between the different kinds of rocks. Perhaps the magnetic fields that these create. And I did read some research actually that Jenny Randalls did a while ago, and it just made a lot of sense what she was saying, because she subscribes to that theory very, very, very much so, that the geology of an area has got a lot to do with certainly a lot of UFO activity, because that's her area of expertise.
Yes.
And I would tend to subscribe to that theory myself. The more research I do about it, the more convinced I am that there's an awful lot of truth in that.
Yes, Jenny Randalls and yourself. Yes, we would agree with that. There's something they're interested in. And when you mentioned water, a researcher, David Polides, who wrote those books, Missing 411, wasn't it, of the national parks, he found, I believe they felt that a lot of disappearances occurred near the water ridges or water lines. So water seems to be one of the elements which they're attracted to, or they're seen around. Yes.
Yeah. So, Craig, now you've written another book, The Black Monks of Accrington, Unexplained Stories from Lancashire and Beyond, and that's just been released this year. Tell us a little bit about what got you interested in the Black Monks.
Well, the area around Warner Street, which I mentioned earlier, has always been quite an interesting area of the town. And I grew up in Accrington.
Yes.
I lived there till I was about 38. And then I met my wife and moved out to where I live now, out near Pendle Hill. And no, she's not a witch, before anybody asks, but it depends. It depends what sort of mood she's in. But yeah, I've spoken to a number of people. I started to research. There has always been a story attached to that particular area. There is a street called Black Abbey Street, which was originally the site of a monastery, an abbey,
right,
going back to, I think it was about the 12th century actually when it was built. So it was going back quite a while, and it actually again it burnt down. It was actually burnt down by some of the local farmers, some of the local peasants in the area.
Really?
Yeah, because they didn't like the fact that the abbey, when it was built, was also given a lot of farming land in the area, and at that time it was just a rural area with a few farmers and a few little settlements dotted about. It's certainly the large town that it is now, and there was an awful lot of resentment by the local farmers, local peasants, and things came to a head, and the story goes that they actually burnt the abbey down, and there were 3 of the monks who resided at the abbey who died in this fire. Now, over the years, there have been a number of sightings very close to the site of where the abbey used to be, and strangely, it's actually on the banks of a small river which runs through the town. And there's been a number of sightings over the years, and I spoke to a few local reporters and a few local investigators, and they relayed to me quite a number of stories about sightings of these black figures, these black hooded figures, all around Abbey Street, all around Warner Street. I had emails from general members of the public, really, who had heard me on podcasts or radio stations, contacted me through my website, and had said, I've had this experience. I saw these figures. There was a gentleman, for instance, who emailed me and said that he used to walk along the disused railway line, very close to Abbey Street, every morning to go to work. And he said one particular morning he was walking along. He said it was summer, so it was quite, coming light in the morning. It was about 5 o'clock in the morning. He used to start work early, and he said in the distance he could suddenly see a figure, and he thought this was very strange because he never encountered anybody, not at that time of the day, and the fact that it was a disused railway line, it was a bit of a shortcut for him to walk along.
Yes.
Never saw anybody else. And he said as he got closer, he became more and more aware that this figure seemed to have a hood up, and he was looking at the back it was facing away from him. And as he got within about 100 yards, he said this figure turned, and he said he could see at this point that it looked like it was wearing a monk's robe or a monk's habit, and he said as it turned he looked at the cowl, and it was just complete blank. There was no face in there or anything. And he said it just disappeared, and
yes,
he said it was really quite scary. Very close by there are 2 buildings now. One used to be the police station, and the building next door to it used to be the fire station. Now, unfortunately, both have been closed. They're no longer used for their original purpose. They were built in the 1930s, both of them. So they're actually Grade 2 listed buildings, so they can't knock them down. So what's happened is some of the local, more philanthropic ghost hunting groups, shall we say, have taken up or had taken up residence in there. I believe they're no longer there now. Had taken up residence in the police station, and they used to do these sort of ghost nights and ghost tours and what have you.
Yes.
And a number of people who had been on these ghost tours had seen these hooded figures. It's a number of hooded figures within the building, and where the buildings are is it would have been either part of the abbey originally, or certainly land attached to the abbey. So the whole area around there really is a sort of hotbed of what seems to be paranormal activity. These hooded figures, these black monks, have been seen by a number of people, and then of course very close by, as I say, is Warner Street, where we've got this poltergeist activity going on as well. So that was quite interesting. And the big legend, the big ghost story that I heard as a child was the one of the screaming woman, as they used to call her, the screaming girl, who is seen on a regular basis on Abbey Street. And the story goes actually that she actually back in the days when the abbey was a functioning abbey before it was burnt down, she actually fell in love with one of the monks, and her brother and his friends found out, and they actually murdered this monk in front of her. Caught them, the tryst, shall we say?
Yeah.
and murdered him. Of course, this is just a legend. There's no there's no records to say either way. But the story then is obviously she died of a broken heart, and she's often seen floating down Abbey Street, in the early hours of the morning, and they can hear her sobbing and screaming and wailing. And some people have said actually that as they get close to this figure, she actually bursts into flames, which is quite interesting. And whether or not that's a sort of little bit of an urban myth that's come from the fact that the abbey burnt down.
Yes, I was just thinking that.
So that's quite an interesting angle, really. But yeah, most of the people that I've spoken to over the years that know about the screaming woman of Abbey Street say that they just see her floating, down, obviously on the road as it is now, floating down the road, just screaming and wringing her hands, and generally making a bit of a show of herself.
Yeah, I must say that I've heard with ghosts and things like that. I mean, I know they're real. We believe them, absolutely. I mean, as I said, our grandfather warned us against poltergeist, and he was a very rational-minded man, and he had a number of experiences himself. But when they state that stone acts kind of like a recording, I don't believe it. I don't believe stone is influential of just repeating echoes of the past. I don't believe that at all. I believe these are entities in their own right, and they visit, or they're somehow entwined in our own reality at that point. It's as if they haven't gone home, or they can't go home. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Craig?
Well, I'm going to have to slightly disagree with you on that one. I do subscribe to the stone tape theory, in so much as I do think that where you have areas where there is a particular very strong energy, sort of
Yes.
assigned to an area, or I think that it can replay something that's happened. So if for instance you've got something that's happened in the past that has been a particular very traumatic emotional experience for somebody, I think that traumatic energy can somehow be left behind, and part of that person can be left behind, and can, under certain circumstances, given the right given the right energy, can sort of play back. And that's why we get these what people call repeated hauntings, where you get the same type of same type of haunting repeating itself, the same behavior all the time, not a spirit that you can communicate with, or a sort of poltergeist type spirit that can interact with things around it. It's just sort of like a recording, almost like a film or a photograph of something that's happened in the past. But I think there has to be the right set of circumstances. I think there has to be the right type of energy there in that place. I think it has to capture that emotional energy, and somehow be able to play it back.
I do believe that. I mean, Ronnie and I have differences of opinions, but I am also of the opinion that, even as human beings in this time, in this space, that we are ostensibly recording experiences. And my idea is that those recordings return back to source, perhaps maybe to expand upon the process of creation. Yeah. But I am absolutely on the same page with you with regards to some events, traumatic events that can, and as you quite rightly said, under unique circumstances and conditions, replay like a tape. I remembered hearing something from another researcher about a group of army men coming back from war, and it was the same thing over and over again that many witnesses had seen. So I'm on the same page with you. But it's very interesting, isn't it? I've got to ask you, in all of your research, Craig, what's your favourite? What's your favourite, case that you've stumbled or come across?
Well, there has actually been a few. I think the one which surprised me the most, and I think was really because the lady that I spoke to, she contacted me actually, through. I think it was through Facebook actually. I'd put a post on a local group in Accrington and asked if anybody had any paranormal experience, and this lady contacted me. She lived in a house in a place called Clayton-le-Moors, which is a sort of outlying area of Accrington, and she had lived in this house for over 10 years. She'd moved out actually at the point where she'd spoke to me. I actually telephoned her and spoke to her over the phone at length, and she was very, very genuine. I can usually tell when people are being genuine and when people are not being genuine when they tell me stories. And I have to say that 99% of people, 99% of stories that I'm told, I would say are genuine. Because people, volunteering these stories. She lived in this house, as I said, for over 10 years. She had a massive amount of poltergeist activity. Some of the stuff that she told me was, worthy of a Hollywood horror film. It was worthy of the film Poltergeist itself.
Yes.
Slamming doors coming off hinges, knives being thrown across the kitchen, footsteps stomping around at night.
Yeah.
Just your sort of classic poltergeist activity. It turned out actually that there was a mine shaft which ran underneath, or one mine shaft from a coal mine, actually, which was located, had been located fairly close by. In the late 1890s, there'd been a massive disaster where a number of miners, both adult men and young children, had died. They'd lost their lives, and underneath the road where this house was situated was a mine shaft, and a number of miners had been trapped down in the shafts and had died. And this lady that I spoke to had got a medium in to the house because things had become so bad. She had a priest in who tried to exorcise the place, and that had not worked. In fact, it had made things even worse. And it turned out that there were at least a dozen different spirits who were attached to this particular property. And they were attached to the property because the pit head supervisor who was on duty on the day of the disaster, who had neglected to, or decided, not to send the cages down to bring some of the miners up who were trapped. There had been an explosion at the pit's head, and he'd been very badly hurt. And he was taken back to his house where he later died. And it turned out that it was this house that she was living in.
Oh, wow.
And these spirits were attached to this house because they were so angry at him.
Yes.
For not sending the cages down before the explosion to help them escape. Yeah. And they simply couldn't move on. They were just attached to this area, and these houses happened to be built on this area, and it was that particular house where he had lived. So there was that one. Yeah. Another one actually, which is a little bit more close to home, was a story that I've been told many times by my wife Sarah and her family, and her mum and stepdad, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, but her mum's still with us. They used to live in a very old farmhouse. It was late 16th century. It was actually one of the oldest standing farmhouses in Lancashire. And it was in a place called Rising Bridge, which is close to a town called Haslingden. But it was up on the moors. It was very, very high up, very windswept, very atmospheric. It's all very, very spooky up there, even at the best of times. As I say, her mum now doesn't live there. She moved out a number of years ago. But they actually had it as when they bought it, they converted it into a cattery and dog kennels. So they ran the business from there for a while. But this farmhouse they had a poltergeist in there who was really very, very active. Couple of examples. They used to hear at night footsteps on the first floor landing, but she said it sounded like very heavy boots on stone flags or on stone.
Yeah.
Now they had wooden floorboards, so they couldn't quite work out why it sounded like it did. And it was only once they actually they had to start taking the floorboards up, they discovered they had woodworm and various other things, and they actually took the floorboards up, only to discover underneath that there were still the original stone flags there.
Oh, wow.
So they could hear these footsteps on these stone flags. And the one that really made me sit up and listen was actually Sarah's grandfather told me this, and sadly again he passed away a number of years ago, but he was in the farm one evening, and he was in the sort of living room area, the lounge area, and he had he poured himself a tumbler of whiskey, a glass of whiskey, and he'd left it on the sideboard as he walked across the room to. I think he said he was going to throw another log on the fire. They had a wood burning stove in there, and as he turned around to go back to pick his glass up, he said it lifted off the sideboard and floated towards him in midair. And he said he just stood there watching it, absolutely aghast at what he was seeing. And then it got to just sort of, maybe about a foot or two in front of him, and then it just dropped to the floor and, bounced on the floor, and whiskey went everywhere. And he looked at it and he said, I could not believe what I'd just seen. It was absolute classic, poltergeist activity.
Yes.
So it was interesting. I mean, this particular poltergeist, who they were convinced was a man, always used to every night he used to go to Sarah's sister's bedroom. Sister's a little bit younger than Sarah, and he used to bang on her door. Never nobody else's door. He used to bang on her door, and Sarah said it got to the stage where her sister would just shout, "Oh, clear off, go away, leave me alone," in words to that effect. And he did. He would stop. But then every night he'd bang on the door again, and she'd shout, "Go away, leave me alone," and he'd stop. So.
This poltergeist, yes, absolutely true. Yes, as I said, our grandfather warned us about them because Philip and I were messing around and bought a book to take the mickey out of when we were young. We were only young and naive. We didn't understand then, and he went ballistic. He said, "You don't mess with the likes of them." But yes, absolutely, and the whiskey glass hovering towards her grandfather. That is actually been done many times before. It's what they do, levitation and things like that. I think it's for attention or mischief. I don't know. It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, I've talked to Sarah about it quite a few times, and she seemed to think that it wasn't particularly malevolent. She never got the feeling that it was malevolent. It was just probably seeking attention and probably just being a little bit mischievous,
Yeah, I think that's wonderful when she just said, "Oh, clear off."
Words to that effect.
Got used to it, yeah.
Well, Craig, we are coming to the end of this most fascinating program, and it has been an intellectual treat to hear. You not only the research that you've done, but also the experiences that you've had, and I think it's amazing. Now, I'll just tell our listeners that your books available are The Shadow Man of Accrington, Haunting Stories of the Paranormal and Unexplained in Lancashire, and also now The Black Monks of Accrington, Unexplained Stories from Lancashire and Beyond. And these are all available on Amazon. And how can the listeners get hold of you, Craig?
Okay, well, probably the easiest way is to go to my website, which is craigbryant.co.uk. So that's CraigBryant.co.uk. I've also got a Facebook presence as well, which is Paranormal Pendle. There's a podcast out there which is called the Paranormal Pendle Podcast. I'm also on Twitter as Paranormal Pendle. But all these links are on my website, so all the different bits and pieces that I do, you can access from the website. So if anybody does want to get in contact with me, you can drop me an email through there. I will always reply to people. If anybody's got any stories or any theories or anything like that, or if anybody's listening and thinks, "Oh, actually, I'd like to talk to him about such and such thing," just drop me an email, and I'm always happy to hear from people.
Well, that is absolutely wonderful. And we want to thank you, Craig, for coming on board Twin Souls.
You're welcome.
And we wish you the very best of luck with your continual research and hopefully more books. I have the feeling that this is not the only two that you're going to write.
There is the seed of an idea which is germinating as we speak. So
wonderful. But thank you very much, Craig, for coming on board.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
And you've been listening to Twin Souls in association with Paranormal UK Radio Network. Our esteemed guest is Craig Bryant, and he's the author of the wonderful books that have just been mentioned. Go out and buy them. You won't be disappointed. And stay safe and look to the stars.